and let folks in from the waiting room. Welcome folks that are just popping in. We'll give it another minute or two to let folks hop into the Zoom room before we get started. I'm glad that you're here. All right, I know we got a short amount of time for what's going to be a really fantastic presentation. So I'll keep an eye on letting people in from the waiting room, but we might be a small but mighty group here. Just a couple of housekeeping things to mute yourself during the presentation, unless you're the presenter and you're the one speaking, just to limit background noise. And then we only have so much time, so we will try to reserve some time at the very end for questions, but depending on what we get through, you might have to contact Jim, Kim, and Aaron independently afterwards. But there is a chat box, so feel free to post your questions in there. And so with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and hand it over to Susan to introduce the presenters.
Okay, I just went away.
We can see and hear you.
You can see and hear me?
Yep.
Great. I can't see or hear anything. Basically, this session is a century of radical labor history in the Pacific Northwest. I hope several of you got to hear Bill Fletcher this morning and Elise yesterday. But what we're going to focus now on is labor in the Pacific Northwest. And it has proved to be a vital and even radical force shifting society toward social and economic justice. In this panel, Jim Gregory, Kim England, and Aaron Goings weave together more than a century of working class history, focusing on the Northwest diverse labor and left movements, its rich history of working class women's organizing, and the employers' organization that challenged and often defeated the workers' movement. The speakers will be James Gregory, who's a professor of history and development of the history and director of the Civil Rights and Labor History Consortium at the University of Washington. He is author of the numerous articles and prize-winning books, and his current research focuses on the geographic history of social movements and American radicalism. Next will be Kim England, who is the Harry Bridges Endowed Chair on Labor Studies at the University of Washington. She is also a professor of geography, and her current research focuses on the migration of care workers, domestic workers' activism, and workplace rights. And then we'll hear from Aaron Goings, who is Associate Professor of History at St. Martin's University. He was previously Senior Researcher at the Institute of Advanced Social Research at the University of Tampere. His research centers on labor, immigration, and business history. His most recent book is The Port of Missing Men, Billy Gold, Labor, and the Brutal Times in the Pacific Northwest. Jim, it's yours.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to try and share my screen now, and we'll see how that goes. And I want to just say very quickly what the plan is. I'm going to start with what we, here's where we start. I'm going to start with a kind of bird's eye view of 120 years of radical movements in the Pacific Northwest, asking the why question. Why has this region consistently harbored new forms of radicalism across the generations? Well, that's not true of many and most parts of the United States. In other words, this will be a geographic history of the left. Professor England will follow, deepening the focus on geography by looking at some famous radical women and how their life paths led them to Seattle. Professor Goins will then turn to the issue of repression, discussing episodes of businessman's vigilantism. As some of you know, I've been developing this online enterprise called Mapping American Social Movements project, with the mission of developing geographic data about dozens of social movements that collectively help comprise the American left of the last century. I'm going to be drawing on that in this talk. And I'll mention this has become a very popular website tool, and you can find it quickly by Googling mapping social movements. This leads me to the question for today. Why has the left found a consistent home here? In every generation since the 1880s, radicalism has been well represented in Washington, Oregon, and certainly British Columbia. Contrast that with states like Oklahoma or nearby Idaho, which saw radical movements flourish 100 years ago, but now are dominated by conservatives and the far right. Why the difference? So here are two propositions. First, we need to understand that the American left has had a radically discontinuous history, by which I mean organizations and movements flourish for a time and then fall apart, to be replaced at some later time by new organizations and new formations. Secondly, these new lefts that appear later are marked by important changes in demography and geography, along with changes in organizations and strategies. So we can talk about 5 distinct lefts, roughly corresponding to 5 generations, and I've listed them here. The first flourished in the early decades of the 20th century and then fell apart in the 1920s. Its key organizations were the Socialist Party and the IWW. The second left reformed in the 1930s and lasted through the 1940s. Its leading organization was the Communist Party. The Cold War destroyed it. The third left, widely called the New Left, but they're all new lefts, was dramatically different. Leadership came from the African American civil rights and Black Power organizations, seconded by young whites in university and youth culture settings. The fourth left in the Reagan era was a softer continuation of the New Left, moving from the streets into the Democratic Party, organizing environmentalist, anti-nuclear, anti-apartheid campaigns. The fifth left has been active for the last 20 years. Media scholar Todd Wolfson calls it the cyber left. Once again, it functions in new ways based on new modes of communication and action on a younger generation, a millennial generation, and a different institutional basis. This left consists of networks, not so much organizations, constantly in flux. Its formations and public presence appear seemingly out of nowhere and then just as quickly disappear. High points include the anti-war demonstrations of 2003, the immigrant rights mobilizations of 2006, the Occupy movements of 2012, and of course the Black Lives Matter movement of the last 4 years. So here's the question again. Why? The Pacific Northwest is one of the few locations where the left presence has been relatively continuous across all these generations. It joins New York, Chicago, San Francisco as what we might call reliable radical nesting grounds. Why? To answer, we need to focus on the transition periods, the times when radicalism is out of phase, unpopular, or dangerous, and think about what keeps it alive in those difficult times and what helps it move from one generation to the next. I argue that several factors can be important. First, transitional institutions, I call them sustaining institutions here. Are there influential political, cultural, and economic structures that are separate from the organizations of the left and yet can keep things going, keep the fire burning in tough times. Second, reputation and with it political migration. Are there widely known stories and memories about a place that lure new cohorts of radicals to a location and inspire younger generations who want to kind of keep that reputation alive? And then lastly, access to cosmopolitan circulations of people and ideas. When the left falls apart in the United States and it becomes unpopular or dangerous to be a radical, the circulation of global networks, people from abroad, from socialist and communist and other green movements and the like, can keep things going and inspire a new formation. So places that have that kind of access are going to have a different kind of history. So let me start by showing you some maps. I want to walk through these 5 generations or 4 of them and show you maps that give us a sense of the geography of these time periods and the movements in these time periods. So the first left of the pre-World War I, pre-20s, was dominated by the Socialist Party and the IWW. Those are the key organizations. And these organizations had overlapping but somewhat distinct geographies, as we're going to see in these 2 maps. So here's a map of 353 towns and cities that elected socialists prior to 1920. And it's a big list. We're starting to elect socialists again, amazingly. But 100 years ago, this was not that uncommon, and yet it only happened in some areas, as you can see. The prime area for this Socialist Party election victories was what I call the Red Crescent here. It's a zone, it follows Tornado Alley, basically out of Oklahoma and Texas and Arkansas, and swings up into the Midwest and across Pennsylvania into New York, the Red Crescent here. And here you can see hundreds of towns and cities, many of them farm towns, and that's what's distinctive about the left in this period. In the Great Plains, radicalism among farmers is very common, and that's going to disappear in later generations. But anyway, so here's the Socialist Party left, and you can see a lot of this kind of electoral. The Socialist Party is very strong in Washington State, and on a per capita basis, Washington State was one of the best places for the Socialist Party in this time period. Now here's the IWW. Our project has managed to record, locate, learn about 1,800 different IWW strikes, free speech movements, arrests, and the like events. And they're mapped here, and the darker red dots show you lots of events as opposed to a few. Now this map is somewhat different. There's a concentration you can see in the east, immigrant workers around the Lawrence and the attempts to organize textile and industry in particular there, and steel industry in that way. But the big area for the IWW, and nobody around here is going to be surprised, is the Pacific Northwest. And the density of events, the publication of the Industrial Worker, and of Spokane and Seattle mark that concentration here. So here we see the Pacific Northwest showing up strongly on both big organizational fronts in that first left. Now this first left is destroyed in the 1920s in the Red Scare, in the splintering of the socialist movement into a communist party and a socialist party, and the 20s is one of these transition periods marked by the emergence in the 1930s of a different kind of left. It's led this time by the Communist Party, and its goals are different. Its methods of acting are different. It's less about getting votes for socialist candidates, and its geography and demography are different too. And this map begins to show us some of that. So here we've mapped votes for socialist, communist, and former Labor Party candidates in the 1932 election. You either voted for Hoover, you voted for Roosevelt, or you voted for the left. And here are the concentrations of vote, not by percentage, but by number on the left. And you can see the concentration in the industrial cities, especially Chicago and New York. That's where the left is really strong. And out here in the West, I mean, the population is not huge, but Seattle and Portland are registering pretty strong votes along with San Francisco and Los Angeles in the West. And so again, the Pacific Northwest is showing up on the maps of this set of left formations. Now, the major institution after 1935 of this, what I call New Deal left, was the CIO, in which the Communist Party and socialists and others are very active, but the CIO is a much broader, bigger set of organizations, the unions. And the latest thing we've done, or we're still doing on the Mapping Social Movements project, is mapping the early years of these locals, the CIO locals from 1937 through the end of the 1940s. And so far we've managed to do 5 unions, as you can see, the most recent being the IWA, International Woodworkers Association, which is concentrated in the Pacific Northwest. But if you just look at these overlapping maps, you see big concentrations in the industrial belt. That's what we always assumed. But the absence, and if you compare this also with the last map, you're seeing that farm belt radicalism of the earlier generation has fallen away. It's not happening anymore. And Idaho is not happening very much with it, and Oklahoma certainly. So a big shift towards big cities and industrial areas in this New Deal left. Now that left is destroyed in the 50s and the Red Scare and repression, and the new left, so-called, I call it the liberation left, because the term new left evokes SDS and white radicals, and actually this whole era is dominated by African-American leadership, first in the civil rights era and then in the Black Power era, and white radicals are sort of following the lead. So I don't like the idea of calling it a new left anymore. Liberation really gets to one of the themes also of the radicals of this era. And they're generationally different, they're young, again, African-Americans, Latinos, Asians, along with whites. The geography is shifting, and you can see here in this map of SNCC actions in the 1960s, now the South is in play, where African-Americans are organizing and acting in the South. Suddenly that region has become a place where radicals are finding things to do and operating. Now the other dimension, the white dimension of this, has to do with counterculture and student radicals. And so the new home, along with big cities, are campus communities, universities and campus communities. And this map, where we've located 2,600 underground and radical newspapers and shown their locations, gets at that new geography. And here you can see, again, lots of concentration in the older areas of the Northeast and Midwest, California, big time, but also Washington and Oregon. But it's a little different this time. I mean, there's a lot of newspapers in the Puget Sound region, but where Aaron is a specialist, the Red Coast, I hope you've all read his book on the Red Coast, Southwest Washington, Grays Harbor, that part is now dropping out. The timber workers who were fierce members of the radical generation before are now not really playing a part in this liberation left of the 1960s and 1970s. And of course, Idaho and Oklahoma are really gone too. So the geography and demography of this left is quite different. And I'm going to jump to the most recent left, the cyber left, which has been operating for the last 20 years. It's so different in every way it operates. There are almost no real organizations behind it. It's about networks, and things are, merge out of nowhere and then disappear. So the demography is really different. This is all young people. This is millennial and Generation Z are leading this, dominating this in every way, and they're all over the country, and especially in communities of color. So it's not just African Americans, but all young people of color and lots of young white people as well. So the geography, we want to think about big cities, again, always big cities, more campus communities and places where young people have been living. Now, this is a map not from our project, but a totally cool map about the Black Lives Matter protests of last year. which, collectively was the largest set of protests in American history, as you can imagine. And you can see on this map, where 4,444 cities and towns have participated. But not everyone's really participating in the same density. And you can see kind of the classic areas around the big cities, and in our neck of the woods, really big. And here, I guess Erin's out on the Red Coast, some demonstrations, but again, that's not the location where this last left, this most current left, is operating. Here's another map, again, not from us, of the women's marches on Inauguration Day in 2017. Fewer demonstrations, but here they're showing the density, the number of participants. And again, you can see the Portland, Seattle, right in there, really big locations for the operations of the cyber left. So let's go back to the why questions and back to the theory of how this has been sustained generation after generation through all these new formations. And the transitions are the important thing, because the transition from the CIO generation radicals to the 60s didn't happen in lots of places. So here are the things that I listed before: sustaining institutions, reputation, political migration, and cosmopolitan access. And here's a little detail about that for this region. Now, one of the sustaining, and by the idea of this sustaining institution, it's not like a party of the left. It's not officially part of the left. It's associated in a way. It survives when the left organizations disappear, and it helps transition and sustain the flame and move and enable a new generation. Now, one of the organizations that's done this consistently on the West Coast is the ILWU. And everybody around in this audience knows about the IWU, this most militant of all American unions, consistently since the 1930s, militant not only in its own behalf, but on behalf of causes of social justice, anti-imperialism, and radicalism. And it's often served as a refuge for radicals in repressive times who get booted out of other unions and take refuge with the ILWU. And in other times, it's a seedbed. It's helping to support new forms of radicalism. So ILWU on the West Coast is one of those transition institutions that I think really helps explain this. And the other in our area, and in a lot of places where there are big public universities have pretty much all along, I think, played this role, but especially since the Cold War, where so many radicals driven out of other forms of public life found refuge in one way or another around campuses, and the younger generation then found the resources and ideas to build new forms of radicalism, both for the liberation generation and the cyber left. And this is a picture showing the day of the Black Student Union took over the administration building, and the march in support. And here, University of Washington has been a seedbed for a lot of stuff over the generation, including the Black Panther Party and the like. And both of these are examples of cosmopolitan institutions. By that, I mean access to the globe, global circulation, people from other countries coming into these spaces. And in times when radicalism becomes very kind of unpopular or dangerous in the United States, it's these, global circulations that keep the ideas going, give inspiration to younger people. And that's what's missing in places like Idaho and Oklahoma, those global circulations along with some of these other institutions. And then lastly, reputation has been very key. And, in our city, and it's true in Portland too, but in Seattle, global attention has come to the city at certain intervals. Certainly the general strike of 1919, and then the WTO demonstration of 1999, which is sometimes referred to as the coming out party for the cyber left, like the birth of the cyber left. This is the first big event in the United States for the cyber left. And they're both gaining worldwide attention and have the effect of encouraging people from other locations, radicals of other locations, to think, oh, something interesting going on out there in the Pacific Northwest. I better go check it out. And that's elicits the phenomena of political migration. That is one of the sustaining features of all this. The idea that people will actually move because they are interested in the political reputation and bring new ideas and new lifeblood. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kim England, who's going to talk about Anna Louise Strong, pictured here. I don't know if she's going to talk about Shaman Sawant, but these are two other radical women who were attracted by the reputation of radicalism in this region. I'm losing my voice just as I do that. Kim, can you get the screen?
Gonna try.
Or yeah, I think I've stopped sharing.
Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yep, looks good.
Yeah. The question for the Zoom era. So I am going to talk a little bit about Anna Louise Strong, but I'm going to talk because she was a friend of Luis Oliveira and Olivero. And so she does wander in, she does have a pathway into the story I'm going to be telling today, and is actually the segue that Jim gave about thinking about people migrating to the Northwest because there's something in the air here, sort of an idea of political migration. I like that idea very much. I will undoubtedly be borrowing it, Jim. So one of the wonderful things about having Jim as a colleague for the last many years, he was a previous chair in Harry Bridges Endowed Chair in Labour Studies, is that he's becoming a geographer and I'm becoming a historian. So we're sort of doing geohistory, I would say historical geography, but whatever. So actually my research is about the contemporary moment. Most of my research looks at care workers, especially domestic workers, migrating to the US and thinking about their the spaces of their activism, the sort of everyday spaces of their activism, and how those connect up with a range of institutions and state agencies that are at other scales, at the scale of the state or the nation, that's that sort of thing. So I'm doing a dive into the sort of bit of a diversion into the historical geography. So this is kind of a bespoke piece for this conference. I became interested in Luis Oliveira for a whole variety of reasons, not least of which was when she was arrested. She was living in Wallingford, in a house that's very near the present day Dick's Drive-In burger place. So I went there a lot when my son was younger. So I was passing her house without knowing it. I'm very interested in thinking about the ways that we can use digital platforms, digital humanities. In geography, we call some of these sorts of things digital geographies, and think about geovisualization, basically ways that we can take digital geographic data and map them. My colleagues that work in the area of digital geographies would be a little worried I'm using this very kind of spare definition of what digital geographies is. They go more deeply into things like ethics and what spaces are we creating. And so I'm just doing the kind of 101 version of digital geography. So one of the things that I have come to love is the work that's been done in the Northwest University called the Night Lab. So some of the stuff I'll be showing today is from this group. One of the reasons I like this group is, first of all, it's easy to use. And I've had the ideas that I'm talking about today for a while, but really never the kind of technological know-how to be able to do any of this. And so the Northwest Night Lab folks have come in and saved my life. But on that regard, I do want to thank Madison Scribner, who's not here. She's actually on a silent retreat, which I think is kind of fun. And she's helped me actually navigate through the technological aspects of using Timeline JS, which you can probably see in my tabs, and Story Map. So with any luck, we'll get a chance to look at those. So as Jim suggested, I'm going to be looking at the early period, what he described as the pre-war left, so the pre-First World War left, and the dominance of the Socialist Party and the IWW. I'm also very interested in looking at the 1960s, what Jim calls the liberation left, particularly the aspect of thinking about that being led by African-American folks and BIPOC people as well. And so one person who I've been looking at is someone that Jim's also had the fantastic opportunity, because I wish that I'd had it too, is to look at the life of Mary Lou Valentine, who came from Pittsburgh to the University of Washington to do her PhD work. She was here for a while. She was very important, and I think indeed was an original leader in Seattle's CORE, the Congress for Racial Equality. I was kind of wondering in that photograph if she might, if at UW, if she might be there, but that's for another time. I'm going to be focusing on what Jim calls the pre-war left. So I'm going to be focusing on our friend here, Louise Olivero, and Anna Louise Strong makes an appearance, as does Kate Sadler. And my idea is that their life paths will come in and enrich the story I'm trying to build, quite literally the story map that I'm trying to build. So I also owe a debt of gratitude in terms of the empirics of, or in terms of the story, to two books, one by Kathleen Kennedy called Disloyal Mothers and Scurrilous Citizens. And then also, that was 1999, and also Heather Meyer's 2018 Beyond the Rebel Girl. So they have helped me enormously, along with some other sources, including the book that you can see on the right, book pamphlet that was put together describing the, by Minnie Parkhurst, who was a good friend of Louise's, and put this booklet together, I think the year after she went to jail, as a way of trying to, prison rather, as a way of trying to raise funds to get her, to try and help her get released. So it includes the speech that Louise gave at the trial and some of the things. And so you'll see a little snippet later on, and why I'm particularly excited to have found this document that's over 100 years old. So what we know about Louise is that she was a Seattle, she came to Seattle for a couple of years. She was an anarchist, an anti-war activist, and exciting for me, because some of my earlier work was about office work and clerical workers. She was a clerical worker. In fact, she trained as a stenographer, an occupation that I had to explain to the undergraduate research assistant that was working with me. And as I said before, she lived near, she lived in Wallingford, which is where I live. And so I'm going to show you the timeline that I have created in NightLab northwest.edu. It's not live to you, the audience, yet. I'm so glad I made a screenshot of it, because this morning it decided it was going to have a meltdown and is actually giving me a slightly different version of it, which is most frustrating. And I hope to get a chance to show you it at the end. I was going to show it now, but it's kind of, as I said, just decided to do its own thing. What you can see on the bottom, and I know it's very faint, is I have a timeline of the US, one of Seattle, and then of Louise at the bottom. And Louise arriving here in 1915, the US entering, I don't know if you can see this, but the US entering the war, and then various pieces of legislation like the right to vote, board versus Brown versus the Port of Topeka, and so they're all along in this line, but unfortunately it's going to be kind of a bit hard to see them. For Seattle, I include the general strike, which Jim made reference to, and so on. So this is something that we're still building out, and I hope to share a version of it, the slightly messed up version of it that it gave me today. So what we know is that sort of the standard story is that Louise arrived in Seattle from Portland in the latter part of 1915. She was about 31 then. I don't know what she did for the first couple of years. Maybe some other people do, and I just haven't found that yet. In April 1917, you can see that the First World War, the US enters the First World War. As an English person, most of my relatives that were fighting in the First World War were in fact dead by this time, because for us it started in 1914. And actually my mother-in-law gets quite upset when she sees that the Americans say the war started in 1917. Anyway, by May of that year, President Woodrow Wilson was giving his stump speeches about conscription. And then in the middle of May, in 1917, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, and this gave the US president the power to draft soldiers, and also allowed within that for conscientious objectors, although initially those were primarily for religious reasons. In mid-June, particularly important for our friend Louise, the Espionage Act was passed. Now, the Sedition Act was the next year, and it kind of rolled the Espionage Act into that. and I'm going to have to read this because it's kind of complicated. It was a crime for anyone to convey information intended to interfere with the operation of US armed forces, the armed forces war effort, or to promote the success of the country's enemies, and particularly sort of the parts that impacted Louise. It also became a crime to, and I quote, willfully cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or to willingly obstruct the recruiting or the enlistment services of the United States. So very sort of long legalese language. Another bit that's critical here, and I actually didn't realize this until going in and looking at what the Espionage Act was that the Act also gave broad powers to the Postmaster General, who could choose to impound or refuse to mail publications that they determined, usually he determined, were in violation of the Act. Huge fines, threats of 20 years of prison and that sort of thing. So in the summer of 1917, Olivero was found work as a stenographer for the ILWW. She'd actually was earning only $18 a week. I mean, that seems, of course, tiny now when we're talking about $15 an hour, but of course, at that time, it was a better salary, but still wasn't a brilliant salary. As I said, I kind of adore her because she was a clerical worker, and I've done work with clerical workers in the past. So she actually only held this job for not even maybe 2 months, and went by the time she was arrested. And it seems that she used a lot of that money to mail out some circulars. So that summer in 1917, she wrote 2 letters. And the first one was aimed at fellow conscripts, which of course she wasn't one, so that's kind of curious. But they basically outlined the option to register as a conscientious objector, or even in the second one in particular, to resist the draft altogether. It seems that she mailed them at the very end of August, spending $40 of her own money to copy and mail the circulars to men in the region. I think she found their addresses or their names in local newspapers. In early September 1917, the police raided the ILWW's hall in Seattle. They seized a whole bunch of stuff, including some of Louise's personal books and some of her circulars. They, of course, thought that these had been put together by the IWW. In early September, so a little later, so a few days later, Louise decided that she would call on Howard P. Wright, and this is the Mr. Wright that you can see referred to in here. And Mr. Wright was a special agent for the Department of Justice based here in Seattle. And she wanted the return of her books. And then they got talking about these circulars that they had found at the hall, at the IWW hall. Mr. Perkins C.M. Perkins was Seattle's postal inspector. So hence I wanted to read that last bit about the Espionage Act. So her house was searched and more questions were asked, and she was arrested for violation of the Espionage Act. So of course, I love this part whereupon thereafter Mr. Perkins, Mr. Wright and myself took the Wallingford car and went to my house at 4406 2nd Avenue Northeast. So of course, me as a geographer, I do secondary readings of anything that's geographical, talking about space, place, and in this case, an actual address and going on the streetcar. How fun is that? So it would only have been a few minutes walk from the streetcar at that time. Of course, the streetcar doesn't exist anymore. She said she had a few matters to deal with and that they were free to search her house. They didn't find anything. She produced a handful more. I think they were rather surprised at her vigor at trying to sort of basically incriminate herself. She was taken to jail in the Pierce County Jail in Tacoma. That's where a lot of the federal prisoners were sent at the time. There's also a suggestion that if she was jailed in the King County Jail, it would be, quote unquote, here's the geography again, too close to the Wobblies Hall. So again, sort of the geography matters here. She couldn't afford or raise the bail, which was about $7,500. And the trial itself took place around Thanksgiving. And she told a newspaper at the time, the Daily Call, that she had no money for an attorney. And anyway, the attorney would, quote, worry more over getting me a light sentence than over the preservation of the ideals I care for more than my own liberty. She ended up representing herself and, among other things, declared in open court that she was an anti-draft, a pacifist, and a philosophical anarchist. she was indicted on 3 counts of the violation of the Espionage Act, and on November the 30th was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And on December the 13th, she went to Colorado State Prison. I'm not sure why she went there. Maybe other people know that, but it actually is close to where, it's the state south of where she's from. So I'm wondering if it was so she could have her sister visit. Her sister disowned her, or however, I'm not sure if she actually ever visited her. So in terms of these ideas that Jim's been talking about social networks, and, you know, there's a distinctive kind of geography to social networks. I mean, to meet people, even in cyberspace, you have to meet them in space. So kind of the social networks are very geographical. Louise clearly knew Anna Louise Strong. Anna Louise Strong, they were about the same age. And Louise had actually asked if Anna Louise Strong would come to the trial. Anna Louise Strong sat in the front row. And this, along with some other activities, subsequently led to Strong being recalled from her position on the Seattle Standard Board. So some real consequences for other people. I think that she also knew Kate Sadler, who for the life of me, I cannot find a photograph of. So I've made do with a newspaper heading cutting here about her actually not being arrested for, oops, sorry, you're not supposed to not be able to see me. What happened there? Okay, I think I'm just going to continue because I don't know what happened. And she, it seems that the two of them, Louise and Kate Sadler, were at an event earlier in the summer where Kate Sadler was subsequently an attempt to arrest her because it was suggested that she'd called Woodrow Wilson a traitor. So she served, Olivera served, okay. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, she served 28 years in prison and was released in March 1920. And after her release, the stories was often things like, well, she worked in a variety of clerical jobs and in Oregon and California and went to San Francisco and kind of disappeared into obscurity. Not all the stories are like that. But one of the things that I became very interested in was this idea of the ways in which people come together in Seattle, a sort of idea that there's something in the air in the Northwest and political migration and the migration of people, you know, to Seattle. And so what I wanted to suggest here to bring a sort of geographic idea to this was an idea that's come and gone in geography. It's called time geography. And it's first introduced by Torsten Hagerstrand, a Swedish geographer. And he had really been a convert prior to this to quantitative methods and had decided that he really wanted to bring the people back in. And so he started to focus on this idea of paths, a daily path, a yearly path, a lifetime path. And here's some quotes from him talking about this. One of the people that did some of their graduate work with him was Alan Pred. And in an article that he wrote in the late 1970s, he used this often quoted idea of one level of analysis. Time geography deals with the time, space, choreography of individuals' existence in daily, yearly, or lifetime scales of observation. Time and space are seen as inseparable. Each and every one of these actions and events would be a sequence that would compose the individual's existence as both temporal and spatial. So I really sort of love the idea that there is a combo of it. Now, the image on the left that you see here, one of the things I want you to imagine with this is that the horizontal part of it is space and the vertical part is time. And this might be two people who come from their homes, they travel to a place for lunch, they leave and they go their own ways, perhaps going back home. It could also be, if we think about it over the course of a life, two friends coming together and they fall out or they move away, or it indeed could be two people come together, they're in a relationship, they split and go their separate ways. So it can be used in a variety of ways. Today, it tends to be used in terms of thinking about time geographies of everyday activities, but in its original idea, it was intended that this would also be for thinking about thinking about people's paths. So what we're looking at here, I'm back, there we go. What we're looking at here is a screenshot, just in case it failed, of my of the work that I've done on Story Map as part of the Knights Lab, and let me just show you some of that. So with any luck, it'll show. I wanted to look at the whole part of her life. So we find that she's born in 1884. We see her in the census in 1900. I am a big fan of ancestry.com. I know it's a sin. And then we find her going to Illinois State Normal University, so perhaps training to be a teacher. And also, I don't know, I have this idea that because she was the child of French immigrants, maybe she went there because it was based on a French system. We have her coming to Salt Lake City. I was not so interested in this one until I discovered actually she was a renter from William Thurston Brown, the Unitarian minister who preached true Christianity as socialism, radical socialism. We find her coming to Portland. She actually worked with Thurston Brown there to set up the modern school and also to work on birth control. She came up to Seattle. Here's the house, contemporary picture of the house. Ended up going to the Colorado State, what's now Colorado State Prison. We find her again in the 1920 census. And I had initially that she moved to California, but I have learned subsequently that actually she came back to Seattle and actually talked a lot about prison reform. So very interesting in terms of a contemporary moment of what was going on there. Then I have her in Carmel, California. I'm not entirely sure what's going on with that part, but one of the things that I think is important to think about the life of this person at the time she supposedly disappears is that during this time, so here she is in the here she is not dead yet. Here she is in the 1940 census, living on Geary Street. So one of the things that she did at this time is that she actually became friends with Alice Park, who traveled to San Francisco from Boston. And she was a vegetarian, socialist, pacifist, and a suffragette who spent many years campaigning for issues around labor laws and women's rights. So they connected together. Alice Park paid Louise money to sort of be her clerical worker in a sense, and also to be a companion. And then several years after that, then we see Louise dying. And this is the only image that I've been able to find of Louise. So I'm going to give you a quick snippet of the timeline because I know I'm taking up all your time, right? And so unfortunately it's misbehaving. Should be 3 different lines, and it's just decided today is the day it won't work for me. And it gives you a sense of the same thing with the timeline. So basically some of what I'm trying to think about is routes, and I'm going to pronounce it in the American way, and routes. So the routes that people take to come to Seattle and how deep their roots are here. Perhaps Louise didn't do so well in Seattle because her roots weren't that deep. And like Louise Strong and Kate Sadler. And I would love, not necessarily today, anyone interested in people that I should be taking a look at, or indeed looking at them themselves, to let me know. And I have taken quite a lot of time, so I am going to stop right there. And thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks so much, Kim and Jim. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that okay? Good.
Yes.
Great. So thanks so much to everyone for being here, and thanks to Kim England, Jim Gregory, Crystal Rogers, and Susan Levy for all your hard work on this panel. I always learn so much from Kim and Jim and everyone associated with the Bridges Center up there. It's one of the best institutions in this state, and to the conference in general. I imagine this is very difficult to pull this off, and it's been great. So for those who don't know me, I'm Aaron Goings, and I'm working on 2 big projects right now that I'll just very quickly describe. this first one's going to take forever, probably the rest of my life. And it's the study to really expand our understanding of the IWW and other multilingual left-wing groups. Although there's been a lot of scholarship about the IWW, about the Socialist Party, about the Communist Party, most, just thinking about the IWW, really only rely on a minority of sources, those written in English. In the case of the IWW, this leaves out hundreds of thousands of sources written in other languages, especially in Finnish, which had all these daily newspapers with heavy focus on the Northwest. And what I found is relying on those rather than only English sources often tells a very different story. The second, what I'm talking about more today, is really anti-union movements, employer collaboration to contest workers' movements. It's useful to read and unfortunate to remember today that the Northwest's most visible corporation is also perhaps the most notorious union buster in the country right now. And much of the nation's attention on labor actually stems from Amazon's anti-unionism and workers' conditions there and attempts to improve their lives through organization. And as with studying workers' movements, which is what I've traditionally focused on as a labor historian, studying those bosses and their allies really can tell us a great deal about our world. So I'm going to try to do this as quick as I can. So at one meeting in Grays Harbor, Washington in 1938, around 250 men in white hoods met to talk about the region's labor troubles. They planned to violently fight the radical unionists who they blamed for the surge of unionization campaigns and strikes in lumber, along the Northwest's largest industry. The group came together ostensibly as members of the Order of Better Americans, but as the outfits indicated, the OBA was really a front for the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan, which had receded from its powerful position in the 1920s, gained a new lease on life in parts of the Northwest in the fights against what they saw as the communist and foreign-dominated International Woodworkers of America, IWA, and International Longshore and Warehouse Union, ILWU. The group consisted largely of local employers. At the meeting, the Klansmen spoke of their intention of taking a prominent labor leader named Dick Law, quote, out to the Union Pacific Bridge, beating him and then hanging him. That name will come up again, Dick Law, especially the last name. Remove the hoods, and this resembled something from 2 decades earlier. In the 1910s, where businessmen formed organizations like the Citizens Committees and Citizens Alliances, American Protective Leagues, and many organizations to terrorize workers, destroy their halls, and break strikes. But the gathering I just described came much later, in the late 1930s, as the Klan emerged in several of the Northwest labor hotbeds and targeted 2 of the American West's most potent left-led unions, the IWA and the ILWU. The Klan's activities certainly caught the attention of Harry Bridges during his visit to Grays Harbor, city of Aberdeen, for the first annual ILWU convention in 1938. With the longshoremen's leaders in town, Klansmen burned a cross and threatened local and visiting unionists. Writing at the time, journalist George Selbus used the term small town fascism for the Northwest's anti-union vigilantism. One of the primary targets of American vigilantism has long been unionists and those on the broad labor left. Northwest employers relied extensively on vigilantism to fight unions and frequently utilized racist and nativist languages against immigrants and workers of color in their attacks. Indeed, from the Columbia River Fish Wars of the 1890s to the industrial workers of the world in the teens and 20s and well into the 30s against the communists and industrial unionists, when Northwest workers organized and struck, bosses formed unions against unions to violently contest them. Significantly, the violence was either committed with the knowledge of state actors or the non-prosecution of those vigilantes. Still, few historians have focused on Northwest employers' collaboration and the presence of violence from above waged by these groups. Unfortunately, historians and biographers sometimes portray lumbermen, the wealthiest and most powerful bosses in Washington and Oregon, as individualistic entrepreneurs pursuing their individual interests. The Northwest employers cooperated in all fields of operation, from fixing prices and lobbying lawmakers to inciting and engaging in anti-labor violence. Building on the work of historians Rosemary Fuhr, Chad Pearson, and others, I see employing class clubs, including their violent auxiliaries, as social movements best understood using the tools of labor and social history. So the remainder of this talk, I was going to focus on 2 brief case studies, but I'll just do one. But to say that throughout this period, 1910s, 20s, and 30s, employer vigilante groups shared much in common. The men who engaged in vigilantism frequented the same clubs, lived in the same neighborhoods, married amongst each other, and spoke in the language of community, citizenship, outside agitators, and foreigners. When threatened by workers who demanded decent conditions or a say in workplace matters, employers responded belligerently, uniting on battlefields against their shared class enemies. The IWW has perhaps gotten the most attention for the vigilante activism against them. I've certainly focused on that. And my hometown, and a place I've studied in a great deal of interest, and it is perhaps 20 degrees cooler than the Puget Sound today, Aberdeen, because of the repeated violent attacks on workers. Here's some images. I'm sorry to skip ahead like this. But because of the violent activism against workers by coordinated employers, the town got the nickname Axe Handleville, which stuck at least in the radical press for several years. So Axe Handleville earned its nickname on several occasions between the lumber wars of the 1910s and 1930s, including in World War I, when vigilantes groups made brutalizing Wobblies, socialists, and other groups regular activity. But the term seemed especially appropriate during the Depression decade. Although national conditions, the New Deal, Wagner Act, and the successes of mass industrial unions changed a great deal of life about lumber and labor, lumbermen did not abandon vigilantism until the 1940s at the earliest. In the early 1930s, as you see these images here, and perhaps you know about this, in one of the great Northwest strikes in mid-1935, thousands of lumber workers from all the different aspects of lumber industry organized, shut down the main financial profiteering engine of the Northwest, the lumber industry. And in the years that followed, workers and organizers spread lumber unions to all different parts of the Pacific Northwest. In response, during the strike, for instance, the state called out the National Guard to occupy Union strongholds. Private detectives spied on Unionists, and strikebreakers did everything from clubbing strikers to bombing pro-Union homes. In the years after 1935, a handful of business organizations coordinated violent attacks against Red lumber unionists, notably the Business Builders, the Citizens Committees, the Order of Better Americans, and the Ku Klux Klan. The Timber Worker, official newspaper of the IWA, founded in Aberdeen, wrote about the Grays Harbor Ku Klux Klan and other vigilantes. Quote, one merchant stated that there were some pretty big men involved with the Klan. In April 1938, the Aberdeen IWA issued a far-reaching condemnation of the Klan's activities. It read, in part, whereas these self-styled vigilantes are now becoming active in the city of Aberdeen by burning fiery crosses at night and sending threatening letters to organized labor. It goes on. Vigilante violence on the harbor repeatedly made national headlines during the winter of 1939-1940. In December, vigilantes destroyed Aberdeen's Red Fin Hall, a massive structure. This, of course, caught national attention. The raid emboldened Grays Harbor's militant businessmen and their allies. Dick Law, a prominent communist and official in the IWA, received a series of death threats. For years, Dick and his family worried for their safety. Laura Law, His wife, a working class Finn, logging camp waitress, one group of workers we need to study in greater depth, logging camp waitresses, food service workers, and a union leader in her own right, fielded a series of threatening phone calls and spent years living in fear. Justifiably, these fears grew after a mob laid waste to the Finn Hall, a site the Laws, as member of the labor left, knew all too well. In 1937, a local pamphlet calling for Dick Law's liquidation circulated on the Harbor, perhaps most best known newspaper editor and future congressman, real red baiter in his own right, Russell Mack and Grays Harbor declared at a business builders meeting, the Dick Laws must go. Dick Law survived the era, but tragically Laura Law did not. On the evening of January 5th, 1940, Laura's parents found their daughter dead in their shared family home. Laura's parents phoned Dick, who had been at a series of union meetings as parts of his duties of local labor leader. Progressive unionists and civil libertarians had a long list of suspects for the murder, especially members of the Business Builders, Klansmen, and conservative AFL unionists. You know, the people who had been making violent threats. Leftists recalled the long history of legal persecution of radicals in Washington. Predicting accurately that the state would try to pin the crime on Dick Law, a nationwide coalition of progressive civil libertarians and union members moved quick to organize his defense. One of the organizations built to defend Dick Law was called the National Grays Harbor Committee. It included a host of nationally renowned activists, including Richard Wright, Carrie McWilliams, Theodore Dreiser. Defense efforts kept much of the nation's labor left fixated on Grays Harbor during 1940. They also succeeded in keeping Dick Law out of prison, even after police and employers blamed him for Laura's murder. The Laura Law case remains officially unsolved. Here's a picture of her funeral, one of the largest labor gatherings in Washington Coast history. The case remains officially unsolved, and the state failed to convict anyone for the destruction of the Finn Hall, destruction that caused around $20,000 in damage in 1940 dollars. So failed to convict anyone, practically, just like practically every act of right-wing vigilantism in the region's history. Still, from the period when these crimes were committed until the present, many unionists, radicals, and left-wing sympathizers have contended that Laura Law was yet another casualty of the Pacific Northwest, several decades-long class war. That police failed to intervene to stop the attack on the Red Hall, and that Dick Law, rather than the anti-union employers or their allies who had threatened the Law family, was the only person seriously investigated for their role in the Law's murder, were two vivid reminders of capital's power to commit vigilante violence without punishment. Sorry for going so fast. Tried to get it in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Big round of applause to Aaron, Kim, and Jim. I have to hop off of this so I can hop on to the next session that I'm tech person for. So sorry that we can't have time for questions, but I'm sure Jim, Aaron, and Kim would welcome questions via email. So I'm going to stop the recording, and just a reminder to